I wanted to just take a moment to think about intervention, and particularly intervention in terms of it being an innovation, it being trying something new, doing something different, and what that creates. And so, when we think about an intervention, one of the challenges for us is to think about, well, how can you be certain it's going to work? How do you know it's going to make a difference and it's going to make the difference that you want it to make? I actually wanted to start off by showing you a video clip, and it's a video clip about some primary educators, and they actually start off with a game. And on the game, I want you to do the game. I want you to feel the game, and it's that thing about I want you to do it not because of the achieving whatever the game is, but to think about your thinking along the way. So in the game, the clip starts off straight away, almost with the game. And in the game, what I'm going to ask you to do is to read what you see. The speaker will take us through it, but I want you to do it. I want you to read out loud, say out loud what you see when he asks you to say it out loud.
So this game's very simple. All you have to do is read what you see, right? So I'm going to count you so we don't all do it together, okay? 1, 2, 3. Amazing. What about this one? 1, 2, 3. All right. 1, 2, 3. If you were Portuguese, right? How about this one? 1, 2, 3. What are you reading? There are no words there. I said read what you're seeing, right? It literally says what are reading, right? That's what you should have said, right? Why is this? It's because perception is grounded in our experience, right? The brain takes meaningless information and makes meaning out of it, which means we never see what's there, we never see information, we only ever see what was useful to see in the past. Right? Which means when it comes to perception, we're all like this frog. Right? It's getting information, it's generating behavior that's useful. And sometimes when things don't go our way, we get a little bit annoyed, right? But we're talking about perception here, right? And perception underpins everything we think, we know, we believe, our hopes, our dreams, the clothes we wear, falling in love. Everything begins with perception. Now, if perception is grounded in our history, it means we're only ever responding according to what we've done before. But that creates a tremendous problem. Because how can we ever see differently? Now, I want to tell you a story about seeing differently. And all new perceptions begin in the same way. They begin with a question. The problem with questions is they create uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is a very bad thing. It's evolutionary a bad thing. If you're not sure that's a predator, it's too late. Okay? Even seasickness is a consequence of uncertainty. Right? If you go down below in a boat, your inner ears are telling you you're moving. Your eyes, because it's moving in register with the boat, say I'm standing still. Your brain cannot deal with the uncertainty of that information, and it gets ill. The question why is one of the most dangerous things you can do because it takes you into uncertainty. And yet, the irony is, the only way we can ever do anything new is to step into that space. So how can we ever do anything new? Well, fortunately, evolution has given us an answer, right? And it enables us to address even the most difficult of questions. The best questions are the ones that create the most uncertainty. They're the ones that question the things we think to be true already, right? It's easy to ask questions about how did life begin or what extends beyond the universe, but to question what you think to be true already is really stepping into that space.
It's got to be novel. It doesn't have to be new to the world. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking, but it has to be new to me. It has to be something different for me, for the way that I work, for the way that I do things. It's got to have value. And it's got to have the value that's aligned with my strategic intent. Whatever it is I'm trying to achieve, that's where the value is. And of course, those first two things together, novelty and value, that's a standard definition of creativity. So we're asking for creativity when we're asking for innovation, the first two steps being novelty and value. And then the third step of innovation is, and put it into practice. And where I think innovation and intervention fall down is where we miss one of these steps. And so if you think about if we take out the novelty and just have value and practice, well, of course, that's good practice. That's what's already going on. It's not new. It's more of the same. And if it's working, if it's got that value that we want from it, then keep doing it. If it's not got that value that we want from it, stop doing it or do it differently. Think about the pedagogical shift that might be needed. If you think about it again, but knock out the value and just think about novel put into practice. Well, of course, that's the thing that looks great. It's a shiny thing that we can put into practice. It's a pre-packaged thing that promises all kinds of things, but it's not necessarily got value against our strategic intent. It's not a good fit for what we want to achieve. So it might have value somewhere, but that value might be somewhere else and not the value that I want from it. I think when independent schools are great at this, at getting shiny things that look good, that parents want, but when you actually interrogate it and say, where's the value in that, what we see is that there's not a very good fit, and sometimes the value is a lot less than it might look like on the surface. And then, of course, the third way that innovation and interventions can fall down. So in the practice, that's a good idea that never gets mobilized. That's got some good research behind it, it's got some good thinking. It might be that somebody's done it somewhere else, but we never kind of take it on wholeheartedly, or we never mobilize it appropriately. There are some programs out there that have got some good evidence, really strong evidence behind them, in that they work, or at least have worked before. So I know lots of people are doing Quick Smart. I'm a big fan of the Quick Smart program. I think it's got some really strong evidence behind it. But it's got strong evidence behind it for that group of kids who are struggling with their automaticity, and that's a particular issue that they've got that's stopping them from moving forward. And so it's really powerful for those kids. And for other kids, we haven't really got any evidence. So whether or not, doing something across the board and how we use our resources around Quick Smart, I think that there's some questions about that, about how do we use the program and put it into practice appropriately. And so there's these kind of three steps, I think: the novelty, the value, and the practice. And when we're thinking about it in terms of innovation, when we're thinking about it in terms of intervention, then we've got to think about all three. And when Rod was talking earlier, and in the literature that we've got, about innovation being timely, purposeful, targeted, and time-limited, then of course I think you can see that particularly in the value and practice, that those characteristics of intervention that Rod talked about come out through our interrogation, our tests for the value and particularly the practice, how we go about doing the intervention. And so if we just drill down a little bit more and think about that, the value and where that value is and what the tests might look like for value, of course, what we're talking about today is the results plus. And so we're talking about the results. The value is going to be in the results. Looking at where we might improve our results, and then once we've started that innovation, looking to see, is this actually achieving that value? Is it influencing the results in the way that we want it to influence the results? And of course, in terms of the plusness, the whole idea of the results plus was putting the learners' stories together, who the learners are, that looking at the data in those different ways, seeing if it's about that problem solving and reasoning, or something else within the data, or the layers of data, and I'll talk about that in a second, and putting those two things together, because we know that they work together. When we were talking this morning, when Dion was talking this morning about that idea of in the school with the Aboriginal kids, where they were getting achievement and attendance working together. The results and the plus, the achievement and the attendance. We're getting attendance when the achievement happened. We get the achievement when the attendance happened. Getting the results and the plusness working together. So it's not one or the other. It's not one tacked onto the other. It's each working with the other. And so that value might be around, the aspects of TEFL. So there might be, when we look at the way in which TEFL, the characteristics of TEFL are being enacted in our classrooms, there might be some aspects that we're really happy with and other aspects that we want to say, well, we could have a focus around that. We could have a focus around that domain. We could have a focus around a couple of those elements and bring those through. That would be novel because we've not really looked at that aspect of TEFL before, or we've not really focused on it or brought it out. And the value would be around, shifted, that pedagogical shift. Of course, for our work, it might be about thinking about those stop and think skills of the kids, improving those stop and think skills to improve the results, to improve the plusness. It might be about student voice. We've seen in those really powerful TEFL pilots that when we get the students in on the story and activate their voices within the classroom, that for some schools has really added that value. We've talked a lot about those low floor, high ceiling activities, making sure that they're equitable because everyone can enter, but we've got plenty of places to go. That it's not limiting, we've not got a low floor and a low ceiling, but we've got a low floor and a high ceiling so that the kids can develop within that. And so on, that strategic competence, the problem solving, and disposition is, of course, something that we've talked a lot about, and I'm going to revisit it again today. And of course, these are some examples, and I've put them all down with EG in front of them because they are just examples. Because I've talked throughout the whole program about your story. What's your story? What's your value? With your innovation, with your intervention, yes, we want to achieve the results. Yes, we want to develop some of the plusness. But what does that look like? Where is the value for you and your kids and your story? I think Tim and Phil, actually, in those clips that we just saw in the last session, summed it up really well when they talked about knowing the kids as learners, not just knowing them, but knowing them as learners, seeing the kids' story in this. So we could take those individual kids' stories and feed that into our intervention. The intervention becomes valuable when it intersects with the kids' stories and how those kids, where those kids' challenges are in terms of learning and developing. And if we think about the practice as well, how do we put this into practice? I think there's two layers in how we go about doing this, how we might think about doing this. One is about our work with our sites. So, you as leaders of this, when you go back and work with your sites, and also the practice of the teachers in the classrooms when they're putting this intervention, this innovation into practice. And actually, when I was thinking about it, it's the same things. It's the same things at both of those levels. I think, if we think about our work with our sites, that takes some slowing down, some stopping and thinking. I think Phil said it well when he talked about clearing the decks. As a leader, that's an important thing to do, clearing the decks, so that teachers are not pushed into that fast thinking, dealing with this, and they're dealing with this, and they're dealing with this, but they've got some space to do that slow thinking. Tim said it as well, in a different way. He said, don't try to do too much. So don't do the overload. Have one or two things to focus on, but that might be enacted in different ways, or it might be, one of the things to focus on might be getting to know the kids as learners and thinking about them in different ways. And so how we go about this practice part, this putting it into practice, really matters as well. And of course, that disposition example at the end there, that disposition, we think about it in terms of the kids, but we might think about it in terms of our teachers as well. How we put it into practice and how we work with our teachers and the other leaders and the other aspects of the community in our partnerships, we've got to take their disposition into consideration and think about how we're supporting or developing or working with their disposition when we're putting this into practice. And this made me think of a well-worn example that I know some of you might have seen before. I used to talk about this quite a lot from some research that came out in 2006. And in the research in 2006, what they did was they got people to bet on the turn of a card. So I've got a pack of cards here. And again, we're just going to do a mind experiment. In this pack of cards, I've got 10 red and 10 black cards. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to bet $100 on the turn of the top card. Okay. So you're going to put $100 down. If you win, you get $200 back. If you lose, I keep your $100. And if the top card is a red card, you win. And if the top card is a black card, you lose. Okay? Actually, what I'm going to do is I've got another pack. So this pack has got 10 red and 10 black in it. This pack, I'm not going to tell you how many red or how many black are in it. There's reds and blacks and nothing else. So just shuffle it up. Reds and blacks and nothing else, but I'm not telling you how many of each one. This has got 10 red and 10 black, and this has got an unknown number of reds and blacks. You're going to still do the same thing, bet $100. If your top card turns out red, you win. If the top card turns out black, you lose. But you get to choose which pack you're going to choose from. Okay, who's going to go for the 10 and 10 pack? Let's have a show of hands. Who's going to go for this pack, the unknown pack? Okay, so great. So lots fewer hands. Who doesn't care? All right, good idea. And in this research that was published in this journal, Neuron, what they found was that in that choice, people the general population, not would always, but would overwhelmingly choose the 10 and 10 pack rather than the pack that is ambiguous, rather than the pack that's got the uncertainty around it. There's uncertainty about probability in that 10 and 10 pack, but there's some uncertainty about ambiguity, not knowing how this is going to turn out, not knowing what's going on there in that pack on the right-hand side. And it feels differently. When you think about the two packs, it feels differently. And these authors used this and did it lots of different examples. And what they found was, and this is a quote from the research, was that people prefer the known over the unknown. And people will sacrifice potential rewards just for the sake of surety. They went on to say that we've got this impulsive preference for certainty. You know, when something comes along, we're doing that fast thing, and we go, oh, we'll do that thing because it's familiar, because I've got some certainty around it. We've got this impulsive preference for certainty, but we've got to overcome it if we're going to exploit uncertain but potentially beneficial options. You've got to effortfully overcome that uncertainty, effortfully embrace that uncertainty and try it out. And so what might that certainty look like? You know, it might look like more of the same. Just carry on doing this thing. You know, carrying on doing what we're doing just for the sake of certainty, even when, if we were to take an uncertain step to ask a question and try something out, it might have potentially beneficial options. It might be about short-termism or quick hits. You know, if we want to improve our NAPLAN results, let's just do it. Let's just drill the hell out of the kids. That'll get us better NAPLAN results once. And then we know there'll be a slide, a slide, and a slide after that. You know, that drilling, that short-termism, that going for quick hits, that going with programs that promise to do this and that. You know, loads of programs out there that, you know, really don't have any evidence behind them, but make lots of promises about sort of quick hits. And things like, you know, certainty around a single tactic. You know, this'll work. This'll work for all of them. We'll just change this one thing. We'll have this one tactic. Not a strategy, just a tactic. We're just going to do this one thing, and that'll work for all of our kids. So a certainty around one thing that we're doing, not one strategy, not one way of thinking, not one principle enacted in lots of ways, but the idea that there is such a thing as best practice, and we'll just do this thing. We'll just do this thing the way this person tells us to do this thing, and it'll work for our kids. It's coming back to that short-termism again. So I just want to stop for a second and give you a couple of minutes just processing time about that idea of intervention as innovation and this necessity to step into uncertainty. What I'd like you to do is, because I know you're already doing it, is to share around your table some of the decisions that you've made, some of the things that you've done, where there's been some uncertainty around it, and the way in which you've dealt that, and the things that you've gone ahead and done anyway, even though there's been some uncertainty around it, the innovations that you've done, and how it's been novel, valuable, and you've been able to put it into practice. Over to you for a couple of minutes. The interesting thing about the card experiment is that when you do it with educators, especially people who are educational leaders in one way or another, and don't necessarily mean in management positions, but in, you know, who are leading learning, the proportion of people who choose the 10 and 10 is much smaller. And I think our decision-making between the 10 and 10 cards and the question marks, our weighing of that, even if we chose the 10 and 10, it's much closer. We don't rush to the rush to the 10 and 10, we really are considering that ambiguity and taking that on. Because we know that in education, there is a lot of ambiguity. There is a lot of need for that creativity and for grasping that ambiguity, of course. And so for lots of people not in education, they just kind of rush to the 10 and 10 and won't even consider the ambiguity. But as I say, even those that chose the 10 and 10, I suspect our decision making was much closer. We were weighing them quite closely and carefully. Before we break for money, I just wanted to come back to this point. How can you be certain it will work? Whatever the intervention that you do is, that pedagogical shift, that shift of focus, that getting to know the kids as learners and what our response to that might be. How can you be certain it'll work? And of course you can't. You just can't be certain that it'll work. If you could, we'd be back in that situation where it would be thinking about education as being a simple thing to do, and so there is such a thing as best practice. You just can't do that. But what you can do is get confidence in that direction in which your intervention might set off. When we talked about data a few sessions ago, when we looked at, if you remember that data from Finland about science and how the Finnish kids were the highest performing science kids in the world according to PISA, and yet had the lowest interest of all kids all around the world, all the kids in the OECD, the group of kids, the country's kids, had the lowest interest in science were the kids from Finland. And so it asks some questions about, if you want to improve the results, which direction are you going to set off in? What we see is that your data, your understanding of the kids, that can give you some confidence in which direction to set off, which direction is most likely to work and lead to good practice, but of course not that myth of best practice. I wanted to pick up where we left off and talk about that getting confidence about the direction in which your intervention might set off, defining what the value might be, defining what that practice might be, and getting confidence in setting off in a particular direction. In terms of numeracy, you may remember, and we've talked about this quite a lot, I think, through the whole conversation about the Australian curriculum and numeracy. This report, adding it up, that Peter Sullivan drew on quite heavily when he was putting together the Australian curriculum. And those 4 strands in there of the procedural fluency, the knowledge and know-how, and those selecting which bit of your maths knowledge and your maths processing knowledge that you would bring to bear in a particular situation. The conceptual understanding, and we know that's a really big issue with, as soon as things start to get a bit abstract, so fractions is one of those first places. We know that kids might have a really good procedural understanding, know how to wield fractions, but if they don't have a conceptual understanding of what a fraction is, then things start to fall apart pretty quickly. We've got reasoning in there as well, and strategic competence. So in adding it up, they talked about strategic competence, but what we've called it in the Australian curriculum, maths proficiencies, is problem solving. But not necessarily worded problems, but actually having to bring some strategy to the problem. Looking at something, going, I don't know how to do that, and then having a response to it anyway. Starting to think about ways in which you might have a go at it. And that 5th strand there, the disposition. And we've talked about this before, and for those of you who've not been to 1 or 2 of these Results Plus sessions, I'm going to do a very quick recap, and then for those of you who have, I want to go a little bit deeper. But I put this graphic up of the strands because one of the things that comes out very clearly from the research is that you can't just have one. You've got to have all 5 working together to get an effective learner in mathematics. And so that point about just let me take a second to say that. And of course, when you look at adding it up, when you look at the maths proficiencies, you can see a really strong overlap with the early years learning framework. So within the early years learning framework, particularly when we're looking around some of the outcomes about, that it's really specific about using that mathematical language and some of those things. So maths reasoning, you can draw very, very strong connections between the maths proficiencies and the early years learning framework. And so if we just take that point about the disposition and just revisit for a second that 2012 PISA survey that had that focus on mathematics, We've talked about this a lot, but let's just revisit it. That point about when students, so this was 15-year-olds all around the world and in different states and territories of Australia, when 15-year-olds all around the world were asked the extent to which they agreed with these statements. So I enjoy reading about maths, I do maths because I enjoy it, and so on. They put those responses together and got an index, a measure of how interested, how much intrinsic motivation students have to learn maths. Whenever I show you these data, if there's a star, if there's an asterisk, that's indicating that South Australian students were the lowest out of all the states and territories, including the Northern Territory. And when there's a dagger symbol next to one of the statements, that's where South Australian students were, on average, had a poorer disposition compared to Indigenous students across the country. And so what we saw with intrinsic motivation was that South Australian students were the lowest in terms of their motivation. I learned quickly in maths. There are those sorts of statements. And so what we saw was that the ACT and Tasmania, who often you would expect to be similar to South Australia, were actually had a really positive self-concept. The rest of us were similar, but South Australia was definitely at the bottom of that kind of similar group. Maths anxiety. So again, other than the Northern Territory, maths anxiety was quite high in South Australian students. And maths anxiety measured by their responses to these statements, the level of agreement with these statements. And then the last one that I wanted to just revisit was the self-efficacy in maths. And so self-efficacy was measured by asking students not to solve these problems, but asking them how confident would you feel in solving this problem. And so what was interesting is, as we went down this list of problems that they were solving, if you look at things like solve an equation like 3x plus 5 equals 17 at the top there, what you see is that South Australians, 84% of South Australians felt confident solving that equation. And that puts them in the middle of the range of the other states and territories. And even that one there, solve an equation like, so that quadratic equation there, again, we felt confident doing that compared to the states and territories. But where we dropped out of the range of other states and territories in our self-efficacy was when we weren't told how to do it, when there wasn't a procedure, where it was, calculate the petrol consumption rate of your car. You can't look at that and it's not kind of straight away obvious what to do. You've got to come up with your own way of doing that. And whenever students were asked to come up with a way of doing that, that's when we fell out of the range of the other states and territories. And so that math self-efficacy was interesting because while we were the lowest with the Northern Territory, it was a particular nature of the lowness of that self-efficacy around those questions where students had to come up with it themselves. Now, let me move on. Now, the reason why while I've put those up, particularly, and to remind us about those, is because we've done a little bit more analysis of this. And what we've done is we've used some data mining techniques. And so there's a number of different data mining techniques. And the data mining techniques are interesting because they're not correlations and they don't necessarily give you this kind of tell you what the answer is or what the relationship is. But what they do is they start to give you some indications. And so what you can see there is how important, and importance has a particular meaning, and I'll just say something about it in a sec, how important is each of those measures of disposition in terms of performance, in terms of mathematics performance. And what the importance means is, if you were to take that disposition and just randomize the kids so it didn't matter, so they were just all over the place, what impact would it have on their performance? So it's not a correlation, though there are some correlations behind it. It's just more of an indication. But you can see that there are 3 of the dispositions that are measured by PISA over on that left-hand side that really look quite important, tailing off with some of the other dispositions. And those 3 at the top are maths anxiety, maths self-concept, and that maths self-efficacy. That maths self-efficacy is the most important factor for performance out of all of those dispositional things. Now, that's probably not that surprising, because if you're good at maths, then you ask the question, how confident do you feel doing this thing? then you probably are going to say, yes, I'm confident doing that. And if you're not very good at maths, and you say, how confident are you doing this, you're probably going to say, I'm not very confident at that. So you could see how the relationship probably goes both ways. That self-efficacy means when you come up against something that you can't do, you think, I can't do that, so you don't do it. But if you've got high self-efficacy, you have a look at it and go, well, I don't know how to do that, but I'll give it a go anyway. And so you can see how it works both ways, that performance might predict self-efficacy, and self-efficacy might predict performance. And I just want to give you a snapshot. I certainly don't intend to go into this in any detail. We might pick out one or two things. Let's just focus on the self-efficacy data. If we look at that self-efficacy data, what we can see there is each score is the score of different states and territories. And the blue data point is the South Australian data point. So if we just pick out the self-efficacy data and look at it in terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. So if we look on the left-hand side at that self-efficacy data, so I'm looking over here, what we see is that Indigenous students have got lower levels of self-efficacy than non-Indigenous students. And South Australian students, while towards the bottom end of the range of Indigenous students, are actually still in touch with the other Indigenous students in other states and territories. Look at the non-Indigenous kids. South Australia starts to lose touch there. So it's the non-Indigenous kids that are losing touch. So there's layers of evidence here. One is that for all of our Indigenous kids, developing their self-efficacy, reducing their maths anxiety, might be part of our story. But look at our non-Indigenous kids, particularly in that self-efficacy aspect. Let me just pick out a couple more. We can look at the data and cut it into urban, provincial, and rural. And so if we start on the right-hand side, if we pick out that self-efficacy again, we start on the right-hand side, what's interesting about rural is there's no rural kids in New South Wales. Well, there's no rural kids reported in New South Wales, at least, so that's an interesting thing. But our rural kids, their levels of self-efficacy are in touch with other states and territories. Our provincial kids, what we're starting to see is that self-efficacy dipping down, and our urban kids, that self-efficacy dipping down. And again, wherever your school is, wherever your partnership is, this doesn't say that this is what your partnership's like, but it starts to help us to ask some questions about which aspects of disposition might we be looking at. What is that plusness? Which direction might we set off in? And then the last way of cutting it that I just wanted to share with you, to show lots of different ways of cutting it, were things like, so the difference between the males and the females. And I think we've talked about this before. Here's our female students and their level of maths anxiety. So what's interesting about that is girls have got lots higher levels of maths anxiety than boys in general. And South Australian girls' level of maths anxiety is the highest in the country. It's as high as the Northern Territory. In fact, it's a little bit higher than the Northern Territory, and certainly higher than the other states and territories. And then if we look at how that has an impact on self-efficacy, again, you can see that our female students are low, comparable to the Northern Territory, and our male students are really starting to lose touch in terms of their self-efficacy in mathematics. So the data allows us to ask questions of ourselves about, what's going on with our boys, what's going on with our girls. Is there something about the geographical situation? Is there something about, the Indigenous kids? What are the questions that I'm asking? These are not telling you anything about your sites, but still asking some questions. The last bit that we did was we just said, okay, so there's all these dispositions. Let's have a look. Let's make them into a heat map. And so what we did was we made this heat map, and each one of these 4 blocks is a heat map around the different groups in terms of the anxiety, self-concept, self-efficacy, and some of those other measures of disposition. What you can see in terms of the colours is, and we'll zoom in on one and have a look at it in a second, what you can see in terms of the colours is, wherever it's green, that says that that group has got a better disposition, that particular disposition, that group has got a better disposition than the other states and territories on average. And the greener it gets, the better we are at that, or the better we have that disposition compared to the states and territories. And the redder it gets, the worse that disposition is compared to the other states and territories. So if we have a look at the reddest, it's the self-efficacy. And so what we can see in this data, the way that this is put together is, the size of the box tells you about the level of self-efficacy. So what we can see is down here in this bottom right-hand corner, our rural kids and our Indigenous kids have got the size of that box is the smallest compared to the others. So in terms of that self-efficacy, our rural and Indigenous kids have got lower self-efficacy than the other groups. The colour is about the comparison with other states and territories. So our rural kids, their self-efficacy is pretty good compared to the average of other states and territories. So where's it the reddest? And the reddest is up here. This is our highest SES and our next to highest SES group. So yes, our highest SES kids have got a better self-efficacy than our lower SES kids. But our highest SES kids are the ones who are out of touch the most, who are furthest away from the high SES kids in other states and territories. It's our high SES kids who have got the poorest self-efficacy compared to their peers in other states and territories. So this comes back to all those layers of what is it about our kids, know our kids, look at the data, ask some of the questions about what our kids might look like. It looks like our high SES kids have got a really good math self-efficacy because of the size of the box. They do have a really good math self-efficacy compared to all the other groups in South Australia. But compare our high SES kids to other high SES kids, and they've got the worst self-efficacy in the country. And that's math self-efficacy, that plusness, relates very strongly to the results. It doesn't give us answers, it only gives us questions. It creates more uncertainty. But it might be an uncertainty that there's some uncertainty, some questions in here, depending on your situation, that you might grasp and take hold of and step into that uncertain space. And so, I just dropped this in before when Rod said this morning about, that intervention might not be an intervention, and it shouldn't be an intervention for, students who are not doing so well. What does the intervention look like for these students who are doing really well? What does the intervention look like for the students who've got, specific challenges or particular aspects of their learning in literacy and numeracy that's holding them back? And, there's lots of layers that we could pick to look at the data. We talked about that analysis that we've done around the fluency and fluency plus. So those questions in NAPLAN that require knowledge and know-how. And probably not much else, but really dominated just by that knowledge and know-how, the fluency. And then other questions that require knowledge and know-how, but require you to come up with a way of solving it. And how our students are doing at that. So we can data mine and look at our data through these different lenses. We've actually added a third category now, a visualization category, where what the question's asking students to do is to manipulate a shape in their mind. It might be that shoe that's one way around. It says which of these four is the appropriate pair to that shoe, and it's rotated in space. It's not really fluency. It's not really fluency plus, so we've called it visualization. We've started to code NAPLAN questions based on the level of executive function. So the total level of executive functions required to have a go at that question, and then the different characteristics of executive functions required to have a go at that question. And and one of those, another way we started to code it is to pick out the questions where one of the multiple choice answers has got a clear misconception in it, a clear trick that the kids might fall for. When the kids look through, and number one is the first answer is the answer that you might think at first, and the kids never have a look at number three, which is the actual answer that just needs an extra little step in thinking, and it's a trick. So we can say, are the kids falling for the tricks? Is that one of the things that's going on? Are they not doing that impulse inhibition? Having a look at all the questions, and are they falling for the trick because they're just going for that one? We can look at our data in all these different ways. And I think that's one of the places where, for example, we can bring the student voice. One of the places to ask the kids about the student voice is have a look at this question. Why did you answer that? What did you think was going on? What was you thinking during that? We've been working with a school who've been really focusing on the problem-solving aspects of the numeracy. And one of the things that they did was they saw in the PAT data that the kids really weren't, there's not that many real kind of strategic competence questions within the PAT data. We've got them in NAPLAN, but not so much in the PAT data. But the kids really weren't responding to those questions well at all. And so the teacher went and said to the kids, these questions, what do you think the answer is to that question there? And the kid went, oh, I think it's this. And she said, well, when we did the PAT test, you didn't say that. And a look of horror came over the kid's face. And he said, you've got our answers. She said, yeah, because I wanted to see how you were going on these different questions. So you know what I said to every single question? Yeah. Oh, no. You said when we finished, we could go out and play. And it dawned on her. What the kids had done is they've gone, this, right, let's go out and play. And so what they got from the results wasn't anything to do with the kids thinking. It was to do with the kids' motivation to get out of that room and go out and play. And so just asking that question, she was worried about her data and thinking about it in all these different ways. And until she asked the question, she hadn't realised that that was the mistake that she'd made on that day, that that was the thing that had happened to the kids, until she'd just brought out that student voice. I think we're going to offer a data mining and interpretation service. So, if you want to think about your data in these different ways and look at these different layers, and that panel that we have that determines whether it's fluency or fluency plus, or at least gives a view of whether we think it's fluency or fluency plus, or the extent of executive functions, we'd be happy to share that expertise with you. I hope it's not necessary. I hope it becomes not necessary, at least. But if that's something that you want to do, then please, give us a shout. The data miner that we've used for the data around the PISA data is available to do that work. I wanted to move on and just make this last point that I wanted to make with this clip from Travis. When Travis is talking in this clip, he's got his footy shirt on, and I found it really distracting. Why has he got his footy shirt on? And it was Footy Colours Day at school. And so they were raising money for, I think it's cancer research, isn't it? And so they were wearing the footy colours. So that's why Travis is wearing his footy shirt, if you're distracted by that. Okay, let me play this clip.
One thing that we've been doing is digging in quite deeply into our results, which are our PAT Maths, PAT M, the PAT R, and also drawing comparisons with the NAPLAN results. A big thing for us as a focus is not necessarily looking at whole school data, but it's looking at individual kids and where our students are lying against each of those standards. One thing to add that to that different layer is to be looking at the ELI results as well, and sitting with each child's results, but also sitting with their ELI surveys as well, and actually looking at what areas are they dipping in. The perfect example for me is I've got a child that I work with quite closely in my maths group. I teach the Year 7 advanced maths kids, and this particular child that's in my group, he did his PAT maths results. We've dug up his NAPLAN results from last year, and he actually performed quite poorly in all tests. But we know that he's a very bright boy, and so to add to that bigger layer is to actually look at his early results, and it actually highlighted some quite significant areas. It's quite a jagged result, and one thing that really stands out to us is the resiliency. He's sitting in front of a computer to do a test, and he gives up. And so that really highlights for us one area in particular that we need to be working on for this particular child and potentially as a whole school.
So I think some of the things that Travis said there really capture what we've been trying to talk about, because he talked about the different dimensions, whatever those dimensions were. He's talking about of course the students' results, because that's where that value in the innovation lies. But what he started to talk about there was they were looking at the ELI data. So they were looking at different dimensions, aspects of disposition in a different way and using the ELI tool. But what you can see from that student is that idea of, that dealing with change, that change in learning, and particularly that resilience was something that the teachers were already thinking about, could already see in him, but they started to get out of the data as well. He talked about, right at the end, this individual kid and across our site as well. Because what he was starting to see was, if there's value for this kid, maybe there's value for other kids as well. Not that certainty that we're going to work on resilience for everyone, but that we might change the way that we're teaching. We might shift the pedagogy to build that resilience, to get the kids to step in and have a go and to support the kids. And we certainly heard that this morning in those clips from leaders. Who said it? Oh, Joan said it, talking about the persistence and how getting the kids to have several goes at something, that productive failure and coming back and having another go. And, we can hear that from what Travis has talked about at Tail and Bend as well. And so what he did was he used all those layers to give himself and to give his staff some confidence about which direction they were going to set off in. And so the kind of big picture is, he's got his results, he's got his NAPLAN data, his PAT data, and he wants to improve them. He wants to improve them to the kids, and he wants to improve them across the site. Which direction to set off in? There's all kinds of different directions. We could do this, we could do this, we could try this, we could do this. It could be any of those. So what he did was, he put teacher judgment together with that. And by putting teacher judgment together with the results, he wiped out a whole host of options and got less confident about those options and more confident about a subset of options. Then he used a different dimension and he started to look at the disposition data. And so he used Ellie in that case, could be disposition data that we've looked at in different ways, but he used Ellie in that case. And what he found was that gave him less confidence in some of the directions to set off in and left behind a couple of directions. Didn't tell him what to do. He didn't say, do this. It didn't say, change your pedagogy in this way. It didn't say, teach maths this way. It didn't say, use this program. But what it did do was gave him some strategic direction. It started to give him ways in which to sort what the options might be and to use his professional judgment and his leadership judgment to pick out those things. This has, now it's got uncertainty written all over it, literally. This has got uncertainty written all over it. I've made it look quite simple, but of course it's not that simple. It's got uncertainty all the way around it. Even from teacher judgment, what does teacher judgment tell you? We know that teachers will think that good girls who are good at playing the game of school are quiet and make themselves greyed out and do that sort of thing. We know that those girls, teachers sometimes overestimate their performance. And the disruptive boys, we know that teachers sometimes will underestimate their performance. And so there's a thing there about, what does teacher judgment actually tell you? And we might need to question that in the way that Bo Lotto, in that clip right at the beginning, was talking about how, we need to question the things that we already know. Results, what do the results tell you? NAPLAN and PAT will tell you some similar things and will tell you some different things. More of an emphasis on the problem solving in NAPLAN, for example, compared to the PAT. Both useful, but we've got to ask ourselves, what are these things telling us? And that disposition data as well. Ellie, PISA, other ways of looking at disposition. What does that tell us? How does that speak to our story of our partnership, our school, and our kids as a group and as individuals? So, if we come back to that question about, intervention, how can you be certain that it'll work for you? You can't. You absolutely can't, because things are not that simple. Some of you I know have engaged with that Cynefin framework, looking at to give you a view of complexity. And we're up in the complex and complicated domain. We're certainly not in that simple domain. So you can't be certain that it'll work. But I think revealing that uncertainty, and sometimes with the people that we're working with the teachers and leaders that we're working with when we go back to our sites, not going back, hoping to get answers from this session today and to go back with answers for them and to give them answers, but to recognize, to say and name the uncertainty that we're dealing with and trying things out to make it, and if they're working, amplify them. And if they're not working, damp them down. But give it enough time and stick with it long enough, as I think Neil said it in those clips before, sticking with it long enough. The complexity that we've got means that we've got to step more and more into that uncertainty. And as Bo said before, if we don't challenge the things that we think that we already know, we'll just end up doing more of the same. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's my email address, you know me. Drop me a line if you'd like to, or if you'd like to bounce any of the ideas, share any of the evidence that I've used for the presentation today. I'd be really happy to share with you. Thanks very much.